A 13-year-old boy sat in a police interview room, his feet not touching the floor. His legs swung slightly as he spoke to detectives about his mother's death. He didn't look like someone mourning the loss of a parent. He looked like someone playing a game he knew how to win. When the detective asked where his older brother was the night of the murder, the boy answered without hesitation, without emotion, without the smallest flicker of doubt. He named his brother as the killer with the kind of confidence that only comes from rehearsal. He knew exactly what to say. He knew exactly how to say it. He thought his age would protect him. He thought no one would suspect a child of being capable of such deception. But detectives have seen 1,000 lies, and they recognize something that doesn't fit. This boy's story was too perfect. This boy's answers were too prepared. This boy was about to teach the world a terrifying lesson, that evil doesn't always wait until you're grown. Stories like this remind us that justice doesn't stop when someone is young. It just works harder to find the truth. If you believe that accountability matters, no matter the age, subscribe now and tell us what you think in the comments below. Let's dive into how a lie nearly destroyed an innocent man. Before the interrogation, there was a home, not a mansion or a place of wealth, but a modest house on a regular street where a mother and her 2 sons lived out ordinary days. The older brother was 17, quiet, protective of his younger sibling in the way that older brothers sometimes are. The younger brother was 13, smart but volatile, the kind of child who needed attention and didn't always care how he got it. Their mother worked hard. She kept the house clean. She made sure there was food on the table. She tried to hold everything together after the divorce, tried to be enough for both of them, tried to create a sense of normalcy in a situation that felt anything but normal. The security camera by the front door blinked green every night, recording the comings and goings of a family that looked, from the outside, like any other. But inside those walls, something darker was developing. The younger brother had started to resent his older brother's position in the family hierarchy. He had started to feel that his mother loved the older boy more, protected him more, trusted him more. These feelings festered in the way that adolescent resentments can, growing larger and more distorted with each passing day. And somewhere in that growing resentment, a terrible idea began to take shape. An idea about how to get attention, how to regain control, how to make sure that his older brother's position in the family would be destroyed. An idea that would result in the death of the one person who had spent 17 years trying to keep them all together. The interrogation room was small and gray, with a metal table bolted to the floor and 2 chairs on opposite sides. One-way glass looked out onto a hallway where detectives stood, watching, studying the boy's every movement. He was 13 years old. His feet didn't reach the ground when he sat down. His hands rested on the table in front of him, small and pale, under the fluorescent light. Detective Sarah Morrison sat across from him. Her notebook open, her pen poised. She had been interrogating suspects for 18 years, and she had learned to recognize the difference between genuine shock and rehearsed performance. This boy was performing. She could see it in the way his eyes tracked her movements, in the way he waited just slightly too long before answering each question, as though he was recalling lines rather than describing actual events. When she asked him to walk her through what had happened the night his mother died, he began to speak in a voice that sounded far too mature for his age, far too controlled, far too prepared. He described arriving home from school at 3:15 in the afternoon. He described his mother being in the kitchen, alive and well. He described his older brother arriving home at approximately 5 o'clock. He described hearing an argument, though he couldn't quite remember what it was about. He described hearing sounds that he later understood were sounds of violence, though he had hidden in his room because he was afraid. Every detail was specific, every timeline was clear, every element of his story fit together perfectly, like a puzzle that had been assembled many times before it was taken apart again. But perfection in a statement is often a sign of fabrication. Morrison knew this. She had seen it before in adult criminals who spent hours planning their explanations. She had never seen it in a 13-year-old before, and that bothered her more than she could articulate. When Morrison asked him directly where his older brother was when the violence occurred, the boy looked at her with an expression of such complete certainty that it seemed almost eerie. He said his brother had killed their mother. The words came out without hesitation, without the slightest tremor of emotion, without even a pause to collect himself. A child who had just watched his mother be murdered, or believed he had, should have been traumatized. He should have been crying. He should have been angry or confused or unable to speak. Instead, he was calm. He was coherent. He was articulate. He was describing the death of his mother with the emotional temperature of someone reporting on a weather forecast. And when Morrison asked him how he knew these things, how he could be so certain about what had happened when he claimed to have been hiding in his room, he smiled. Not a small smile, not a nervous smile. A full, visible smirk that suggested he found the detective's questions amusing. Behind the one-way glass, the other detectives in the room felt their instincts firing all at once. Something was wrong with this picture. The boy's narrative was too clean. His emotional presentation was too flat. His certainty was too absolute. Detective James Chen, who had been in the hallway for the entire interview, turned to his partner and said quietly, "He's lying." His partner, Detective Marcus Williams, nodded without taking his eyes off the glass. Both men had spent enough time interrogating suspects to recognize when someone was performing, when someone was following a script, when someone had planned what they were going to say and had rehearsed it enough times that it came out sounding natural. The difference with this boy was that he had rehearsed it so well that it had become wooden, so calculated that it had become obviously artificial to anyone trained to notice. Morrison pressed him on specific details. When did he hear the arguing start? He corrected her phrasing. He said he didn't hear it start, but rather that he became aware of it. The language was too precise, too adult. A 13-year-old would say, "I heard them fighting." This boy used the phrase, "I became aware of an escalating vocal conflict." Morrison asked him to repeat that. He did, without hesitation. She asked him where he got that phrase. He said he wasn't sure what she meant. She asked him if he had heard someone else use that phrase before. He said possibly, though he couldn't remember who. The interview continued for another 45 minutes, and with each question, the certainty grew. This boy was not a traumatized child reporting on his mother's murder. This boy was a calculated manipulator who had decided to destroy his older brother, and he had put considerable thought into how he would do it. As the interview was winding down, Morrison mentioned something almost casually. She said that the home security system had a backup cache. She said that even deleted footage could sometimes be recovered. She said this to gauge his reaction, and for the first time since the interview had begun, something flickered across the boy's face. A moment of uncertainty, a moment where his composure cracked. It was just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but it was there. Morrison caught it. The detectives behind the glass caught it. In that moment, everyone in that room understood that there was something about that security system that mattered. There was something about that camera that this boy had tried to erase. And if there was something he had tried to hide, then perhaps everything he had said about his older brother was a lie constructed with remarkable precision by a 13-year-old who understood far too much about how to manipulate adults and how to frame someone for a crime. Morrison closed her notebook. The interview was over. The boy was taken to a holding area. And in the hallway, Detective Chen looked at his partner and said the words that would define the next several weeks of the investigation. The brother didn't do it, the kid did, and he nearly got away with it. Before there was a crime scene, there was a morning. The morning of the day that changed everything, a woman named Catherine woke up at 6:30 in the morning, just like she did every day. She got out of bed, she showered, she dressed in the clothes she would wear to work at the office where she had been employed for 11 years. She made coffee. She poured it into a travel mug that she kept by the sink. She checked that her younger son had his backpack for school. She reminded him about the homework project that was due. She kissed him on the forehead. These were the things a mother did. These were the ordinary rituals that kept a household functioning, that created structure and routine and the sense that someone was in control, that someone was making sure everything would be okay. Catherine had been doing these things every morning for 17 years, ever since her first son was born. She had done them through a difficult marriage. She had done them through a divorce. She had done them while working full-time and coming home to a house that needed her attention and 2 sons who needed her in different ways. The older brother, 17 years old, was in the final year of high school. He was quiet. He kept to himself. He spent time in his room studying or working on projects on his computer. He was the kind of teenager who didn't require much, who made good grades, who stayed out of trouble. Catherine often marveled at how different he was from his younger brother. Where the older boy was calm and thoughtful, the younger boy was energetic and demanding. Where the older boy seemed content to exist in the background, the younger boy seemed to need to be the center of every conversation. Every family decision, every moment. It wasn't malice, it was just personality. Some children are born needing more attention, more affection, more reassurance. Some children are born satisfied with less. Catherine tried to give each of them what they needed, though she sometimes wondered if she was doing right by them, if she was balancing things correctly, if she was loving them enough. The younger brother, 13 years old, was smart. Teachers said so. His test scores were good. He was capable of sophisticated thinking and complex reasoning. But there was something else about him, something that Catherine sometimes felt but couldn't quite name. A lack of empathy, an inability or an unwillingness to consider how other people felt. When his older brother was sick, the younger boy seemed more interested in the disruption to his own routine than in his brother's well-being. When Catherine had a difficult day at work, the younger boy wanted to complain about his own problems rather than listen. Catherine had mentioned this to friends, trying to understand if it was normal 13-year-old behavior or something more concerning. Her friends assured her that teenage boys were often self-centered, that it was normal, that he would grow out of it. Catherine wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that her younger son was just being a normal adolescent, not someone fundamentally different, not someone without the capacity to care about others in the way that most people did. The house where they lived was a 3-bedroom suburban home in a quiet neighborhood. Catherine had chosen it carefully when she and her husband were separating. She wanted a place where her sons would feel safe, where neighbors looked out for each other, where children played outside and parents knew each other's names. She had installed a security camera by the front door, not because she was paranoid, but because it seemed like the responsible thing to do. The camera recorded continuously. It had a backup system that kept footage for 30 days. Catherine felt reassured knowing that the camera was there, knowing that if anything ever went wrong, if there was ever an incident in the neighborhood, she would have footage of it. She had no idea that the camera would record the last day of her life. She had no idea that her younger son would try to disable that camera so that he could carry out a plan that he had been thinking about for longer than she realized. Catherine's last day began like every other day. She went to work, she did her job, she had lunch with a colleague. She checked her phone and sent a text to her older son asking him to make sure his brother had a snack after school. She sent another text to a friend talking about a movie they were planning to watch together on the weekend. She was making plans. She was thinking about the future. She was existing in a state of present-time awareness where she had no idea that the future she was planning for would never arrive. She left work at 5 o'clock. She drove home. She pulled into the driveway. She gathered her things from the car. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside, not knowing that the security camera had captured her arrival, not knowing that this was the last moment of her life when she was still able to step back out into the world if she wanted to. The house was quiet when she entered. This wasn't unusual. Her younger son would be upstairs in his room, probably on his computer or his phone. Her older son would likely still be at school or on his way home from an after-school activity. Catherine put her work bag down. She took off her shoes. She moved through the familiar space of her home, a home that she had chosen and maintained and filled with the evidence of her love for her sons. Photographs on the walls, artwork on the refrigerator, books on the shelves. Comfortable furniture that had been worn smooth by years of family use. This was her sanctuary. This was the place where she felt most herself, most capable, most able to manage the complexities of single motherhood and professional responsibility, and the weight of trying to be enough for everyone who depended on her. The police arrived at the house at 6:47 in the evening. A neighbor had called them after hearing sounds from inside the house that didn't seem right. Sounds that lasted for several minutes and then stopped abruptly, replaced by silence that felt heavier than normal silence. The responding officers found the front door locked. They announced themselves. No one answered. They used a key that Catherine had provided to the emergency services system. They entered the house with caution, not knowing what they were walking into. The living room was the first space they saw. Catherine was there. She was on the floor. She was not moving. Her body bore evidence of blunt force trauma. The weapon, a kitchen implement, was found nearby. The television was still on, tuned to a news broadcast from earlier in the day. Photographs lay scattered on the floor, as though the struggle had knocked them from surfaces. The kitchen door was ajar. The back door was locked from the inside. The windows were all closed and locked. This was not a crime of forced entry. This was a crime committed by someone already inside the house. The crime scene investigators moved through the space with the methodical precision that comes from training and experience. They photographed everything. They documented the position of the body. They collected evidence. They noted the absence of forced entry and the presence of a key that would have unlocked the back door hanging on a hook by the kitchen sink. They took measurements and swabs and samples. They interviewed the neighbors who had called. The neighbors reported that they had seen both boys come home from school. The neighbors reported that they had not seen either boy leave the house after that. The neighbors reported that the house had seemed quiet, normal, ordinary, until the sounds began. The sound of arguing, the sound of something falling, the sound that suggested violence occurring inside a normal suburban home on an ordinary afternoon. The younger brother was found in his room upstairs. He was crying. His hands were clean. His clothes showed no evidence of blood spatter. He told the first responders that he had been hiding in his room because he was scared. He said he had heard his mother and older brother fighting. He said he didn't know what they were fighting about. He said he had heard sounds that frightened him. He said he had stayed in his room until he heard sirens. His performance was convincing. A child hiding in fear during a violent act would look exactly like this child looked, pale, traumatized, shocked. The responders felt sympathy for him. A child witnessing violence against a parent, a child hiding in fear for his own safety, a child traumatized by what had happened in the room below. No one questioned his narrative at that moment. No one suspected that the tears he was crying were performance, that his fear was manufactured, that his account of events was a carefully constructed lie. The older brother was not at home. Investigators looked for him. They checked the school. They checked with friends. His car was found parked at a mall approximately 3 miles from the house. Officers located him inside the mall, confused and disoriented when they told him what had happened. He had no knowledge of the crime. He had gone to the mall after school. He had walked around. He had been thinking about a project for school. He had been trying to figure out what he wanted for his birthday. He had no idea that his mother was dead. He had no idea that he was about to be accused of murdering her. When the officers told him what had happened, his reaction was genuine shock and grief. He collapsed. He couldn't breathe. He vomited. He asked repeatedly if they were sure, if they were certain, if there was any possibility that they had made a mistake. His emotional response was consistent with a teenager learning that his mother had been murdered. It was inconsistent with a teenager who had just committed that murder. The crime scene itself told a story, though the story it told was being misinterpreted by investigators who made an assumption that seemed logical at the time. A 17-year-old boy with a troubled relationship with his mother seemed like a plausible suspect. 17-year-old boys had committed murders before. Conflict between mothers and teenage sons sometimes escalated to violence. The narrative seemed to fit. The older brother fit the profile of someone who might commit such a crime. A quiet boy. A boy who kept to himself. A boy who might harbor resentments that manifested in sudden, explosive violence. The security system had recorded the crime, but not all of it. There was a gap in the footage. 11 minutes of missing recording that corresponded to the time of the murder. The system showed the older brother arriving home. The system showed him entering the house. Then the recording went black. When it resumed, Catherine was already dead. The investigators didn't initially question this gap. They assumed it was a technical malfunction. They assumed the system had glitched. They didn't consider the possibility that someone had deliberately disabled the camera. They didn't consider that someone might have figured out how to delete footage. They didn't consider that someone in the house had technical knowledge and motivation to cover up what had occurred. Because the person who would have the most motivation to cover up this crime was the person who appeared to be the most innocent. The younger brother who had been hiding in his room, who had called for help through his tears, who had seemed so traumatized that investigators felt sympathy for him rather than suspicion. The interrogation of the older brother began within hours of his arrest. He was brought to a police station. He was placed in a small room. He was read his rights. A detective sat across from him and asked him about his mother's death. The boy's response was confusion. He didn't understand the accusation. He had been at the mall. He had witnesses who could confirm he had been there. He had receipts for purchases he had made. His phone location data would show he had been nowhere near his home during the time of the murder. He was innocent. He knew he was innocent, but innocence doesn't always protect you. A narrative had been constructed. An older brother with conflict with his mother, a younger brother's eyewitness account. The motivation and opportunity seemed to exist. The confession of guilt that should have come didn't, but investigators sometimes interpret innocence as evasiveness, truthfulness as deception. The younger brother was interviewed separately. Detectives asked him to walk through what had happened. He told his story with remarkable consistency. He described the argument between his mother and older brother. He described the escalation. He described the violence. He described hiding in his room out of fear. Each time he was asked to repeat the story, the details remained the same. In a real account of traumatic events, details often shift. Memory is fallible. The human mind, especially under stress, sometimes reconfigures the order of events or forgets specific elements. The younger brother's account never wavered. It was consistent in a way that seemed trustworthy, that seemed reliable. Detectives took it as confirmation that his memory was accurate. They didn't recognize it as a sign that the story had been rehearsed, that he had practiced it until it was perfect, that he had designed it to be unshakable, under questioning. The physical evidence seemed to support the narrative the younger brother had constructed. The older brother had been in the house at the time of the crime. His arrival was captured on the now functioning security camera. His presence could not be disputed. The younger brother had been in his room. There was no evidence placing him at the scene. His hands were clean. His clothes were clean. He had been crying. He had called for help. Everything about his presentation suggested innocence and trauma. Everything about the older brother's presentation suggested guilt and evasion. When the older brother said he was at the mall, investigators checked and found that yes, he had been at the mall, but he could have left earlier, could have come home, could have committed the murder, and returned to the mall to establish an alibi. The timeline was tight but potentially possible. Detectives began to construct a narrative where the older brother had come home, killed his mother in a moment of rage, left the scene, returned to the mall to establish an alibi, and had nearly gotten away with it if not for his younger brother's courage in coming forward. The evidence seemed to fall into place. The older brother was arrested. He was charged with murder. The news outlets picked up the story. A mother killed by her teenage son. A younger brother's heroic decision to testify against his own sibling. The narrative was compelling. It was sympathetic. It was the kind of story that made sense to people who read about it or watched the news coverage. A disturbed teenage boy. A mother-son conflict that turned violent. Justice beginning its slow work. The only problem was that the narrative was backwards. The story had been sold to investigators by the person who was most clever at telling it, who was most capable of recognizing what adults wanted to believe, who had deliberately constructed a false accusation so convincing that it nearly succeeded in destroying an innocent person. The behavioral analysis came later, but when it came, it painted a picture that investigators had missed. The psychologist who reviewed the case noted patterns in the younger brother's behavior that extended far beyond this single crime. His school records contained multiple accounts of false accusations. A teacher whom he claimed had spoken inappropriately to him, the accusations were investigated and found to be fabricated. A classmate whom he claimed had threatened him, the classmate was innocent. A coach whom he claimed had shown favoritism, the allegation was made out of resentment, not reality. The younger brother had a history of using accusations as a tool to manipulate situations, to regain attention, to punish people who he felt had slighted him. This was his pattern. This was his method. And his mother had apparently become the target of his most elaborate manipulation yet. Teachers remembered him being preoccupied with crime. He watched true crime documentaries. He read true crime books. He knew about criminal justice procedures. He understood how investigations worked. He understood the concept of alibis and how to construct one for someone else. He understood the concept of forensic evidence and how to create confusion about it. In one English class, he had written an essay about a fictional teenager who frames his sibling for a crime. The teacher had found the essay disturbing enough to mention it to the school counselor. The counselor had spoken to the younger brother about his writing, and he had explained that it was just fiction, just creative writing, nothing to be concerned about. But the concern should have been sounded. The essay was a blueprint. It was a test. It was practice for the real thing. The psychologist who reviewed the case described the younger brother as displaying characteristics consistent with narcissistic personality patterns. An excessive need for attention, an inability to empathize with other people's suffering, a willingness to harm others if it served his interests, a sense of entitlement, a belief that normal rules didn't apply to him, a talent for manipulation and deception. These were the traits of someone who would be capable of framing a sibling for murder, who would be willing to send an innocent person to prison in order to satisfy his own need for attention and control. The psychologist noted that in his conversations, the younger brother didn't seem to grasp the magnitude of what he had done. He didn't understand that his actions had resulted in the death of his mother. He didn't understand that his false accusation could have resulted in his brother spending the rest of his life in prison. He understood only that he had accomplished something, that he had gotten what he wanted, which was attention and control. The search history on his computer revealed that he had looked up information about disabling security cameras. He had researched how the model of camera that his mother owned could be deleted or disabled. He had apparently spent weeks researching this, understanding the technical aspects, preparing for the execution of whatever plan he had in mind. He had also searched for information about forensic evidence. He wanted to understand what would be found at a crime scene and how investigators would use that information to determine what had happened. He had studied crime scene investigation techniques. He had watched videos about how to behave in an interrogation. He had prepared. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence committed by a disturbed child. This was premeditation at a level that should have been impossible for a 13-year-old. And yet it had happened. Family interviews revealed additional troubling patterns. Relatives recalled games that the younger brother had wanted to play, where he would accuse them of something they hadn't done, where he would construct elaborate lies, where he seemed to enjoy the chaos and confusion that resulted from his deceptions. Relatives also recalled that he had seemed unmoved by his mother's death in a way that was concerning. When his older brother was arrested, the younger brother had expressed a kind of satisfaction, a quiet sense of having accomplished something. He had not expressed grief. He had not expressed remorse. He had expressed what seemed like completion, like satisfaction that a plan had come to fruition. The psychologist who reviewed all of this concluded that the younger brother was capable of calculated manipulation at a level that was unusual even for someone with narcissistic tendencies. He was, in essence, a 13-year-old with the capacity for adult-level deception and a willingness to destroy lives in order to satisfy his own psychological needs. Detective Sarah Morrison was the one who pushed for a deeper forensic analysis of the security system. Something about the boy's reaction when she mentioned the backup cache had bothered her. She had requested that the entire system be analyzed by a digital forensics specialist. The specialist was a woman named Dr. Lisa Chen, who had spent 15 years recovering data from damaged, deleted, or corrupted systems. Dr. Chen took the security system apart. She examined the hardware. She looked at the backup cache. And slowly, carefully, piece by piece, she began to recover fragments of the deleted footage. The recovery was not complete. Large sections of the recording had been deliberately overwritten. But fragments remained. Pieces of video, snippets of audio, time-stamped segments that corresponded to the time of the murder. What Dr. Chen recovered was devastating. It showed the younger brother alone in the house. It showed him moving through the kitchen. It showed him accessing the security system's control panel. It showed him entering commands that would delete the footage. The timestamp showed that this occurred approximately 6 minutes after the older brother had left the house to go to the mall. The timestamp showed that the younger brother knew how to access and manipulate the system. The audio fragments contained sounds that appeared to be the younger brother's voice, speaking to someone, though the content was partially corrupted. The fragments that could be reconstructed seemed to show the younger brother describing his actions, as though he was explaining what he was doing to someone, or as though he was recording his own thoughts for posterity. Dr. Chen presented her findings to Detective Morrison. The implications were clear. The younger brother had disabled the camera. The younger brother had been home at the time of the crime. The younger brother's narrative about being upstairs hiding in his room was contradicted by the forensic evidence. The younger brother's claim that his older brother had committed the murder was a lie. The evidence didn't prove definitively who had committed the murder, but it proved that the older brother could not have committed it during the gap in footage, and it proved that the younger brother was present and capable of disabling the security system. The timeline that had seemed so damning for the older brother suddenly began to unravel. The case that had seemed so solid suddenly had a crack in it. And in that crack, the truth began to emerge. Detective Morrison requested new warrants. She requested a more thorough analysis of the physical evidence. She requested interviews with new witnesses. She requested that the younger brother be interrogated again, this time with knowledge of what the forensic analysis had revealed. The boy was brought back to the interrogation room. This time, Morrison presented him with the evidence. She showed him the fragments of video. She showed him the timestamps. She showed him the proof that his story was false. And for the first time, the younger brother's perfect composure began to crack. He denied everything. He claimed the footage was fake. He claimed that Dr. Chen had made a mistake. He claimed that he was being framed. His denials became increasingly desperate, increasingly incoherent. The narrative that had been so carefully constructed began to collapse under the weight of forensic evidence. The older brother's father was informed that his son would be released. The charges would be dropped. The arrest had been a mistake. The real perpetrator was his younger son. The father's response was initially one of relief. His innocent son would go free. But that relief was quickly consumed by a different emotion: betrayal. His younger son, the child he had tried to support despite the divorce, the child he had continued to love despite the limitations of his relationship with the boy's mother, had deliberately framed his older son for murder, had deliberately caused the death of the boy's mother, had deliberately attempted to destroy his older brother's future. The father struggled to reconcile the child he thought he knew with the child who had apparently done these things. He brought the older brother home from police custody. He held him while he cried. He told him that none of this was his fault. But internally, the father was broken by the knowledge of what his younger son had done. The older brother's recovery would take years. The trauma of being accused of murdering his mother, of being arrested, of being interrogated, of being branded as a murderer, even though he was innocent, left psychological scars that time could not fully heal. He had nightmares. He developed anxiety. He struggled with the knowledge that his own brother had deliberately tried to destroy his life. The two brothers could never again have a normal relationship. They could never again live in the same house. They could never again look at each other without remembering what had happened, without remembering the betrayal, without remembering that they were related by blood to someone who was willing to commit murder and frame him for it. The younger brother, for his part, seemed less affected by the revelation of his crimes. When confronted with the forensic evidence, when confronted with the proof that he had lied, when confronted with the reality of what he had done, his primary emotion seemed to be anger at having been caught. He didn't express remorse for his mother's death. He didn't express regret for accusing his brother. He expressed frustration that his plan had failed, that the system had caught him, that he was now facing consequences. Relatives who visited him in juvenile detention reported that he seemed less concerned about his mother and more concerned about how his case might affect his own future. The lack of remorse was remarkable. The absence of any recognition that what he had done was wrong was disturbing. The psychologist who continued to evaluate him noted that the boy seemed incapable of understanding why anyone would expect him to feel guilt or sadness about his mother's death. In his worldview, his mother had been an obstacle to his freedom. Removing her was a logical action. The fact that he had also framed his brother was simply an additional tactical decision, no more morally significant than any other lie he had ever told. The community that had initially sympathized with the younger brother's situation, a child who had witnessed his mother's murder, a child who had bravely come forward to accuse his own brother, now had to reckon with the reality that the sympathetic narrative had been constructed deliberately by a calculating adolescent. The news coverage shifted. Journalists who had portrayed the younger brother as heroic now had to report that he was actually the perpetrator. The mother's family, who had initially appreciated the younger brother's willingness to testify against his older brother, now had to confront the knowledge that the younger brother had murdered their daughter, their sister, their loved one. The family's grief, which had had a focus, which had had a direction, now became more diffuse and more complicated. They were not grieving the loss of a mother killed by a violent son. They were grieving the loss of a mother killed by the child who should have been most protected, most innocent, most deserving of sympathy. The juvenile court was different from the adult court system. The proceedings were closed to the public. The media was allowed in, but limited in what they could report. The goal was theoretically to protect the younger brother's privacy, to allow him the possibility of rehabilitation, to recognize that adolescence is a time of development and potential change. But the evidence was so overwhelming and the crime was so serious that the proceedings took on a different character. The judge in the case was a woman named Eleanor Hastings, who had presided over juvenile cases for 23 years. She had seen troubled children. She had seen violent children. She had seen children who had made serious mistakes and needed guidance back toward better choices. But she had rarely seen a child as coldly calculated as the one now sitting in front of her. The younger brother entered the courtroom in detention clothing. He was still a minor. So the court maintained certain protections for his identity. The public didn't know his face. The media couldn't publish his name. The proceedings were designed to preserve what the juvenile justice system called his rehabilitative potential. But Judge Hastings looked at the boy and saw something that troubled her. She saw composure. She saw a lack of apparent fear. She saw someone who seemed unbothered by the gravity of his situation. When she asked him if he understood the charges against him, he answered with a kind of casual indifference. Yes, he understood. He was accused of his mother's death. He understood. The way he said it suggested that he was complying with a procedural requirement, not genuinely engaging with the meaning of the charges. The defense attorney presented arguments about the boy's age, about his potential for rehabilitation, about the neurological developments that were still occurring in adolescent brains, about the possibility that the boy had acted under some form of psychological duress or compulsion that he didn't fully understand. The prosecution countered that the evidence demonstrated premeditation. The boy had researched how to disable the security camera. The boy had studied crime scene investigation. The boy had constructed a false narrative and had practiced it until it was flawless. These were not the actions of a child acting on impulse. These were the actions of someone who understood what he was doing and had decided to do it anyway. Judge Hastings listened to both sides. She reviewed the evidence. She read the psychological evaluations. She looked at the boy's history of false accusations, his manipulation, his apparent lack of remorse. And she made a ruling that indicated how she was leaning. She said that while she was limited in what she could do in juvenile court, she noted that the evidence suggested a level of calculated deception that was unusual. She noted that the boy's lack of apparent remorse was concerning. She noted that she would be watching his case carefully, and that if he was ever prosecuted in adult court, which was possible given the severity of the crime, the evidence would be damning. The gavel came down. The preliminary hearing was over. The case would now move forward toward trial, and the community would wait to see whether a 13-year-old would face the consequences of premeditated murder. The trial proceedings were straightforward and devastating. The prosecution presented evidence methodically. The security camera fragments were played for the jury. The digital forensics expert testified about the recovery of the deleted footage. The experts explained how the younger brother's actions had revealed his guilt. The timeline that had seemed so clear in the older brother's case now reversed itself. The older brother had been at the mall. The younger brother had been home. The older brother had no motive. The younger brother had motive in abundance, resentment, a desire for control, a sense that his mother stood in his way. Dr. Chen took the stand and explained her findings in language that anyone could understand. She showed how the cash recovery had revealed fragments that placed the younger brother at the scene. She showed how the timestamps aligned with the deleted footage. She showed how the evidence pointed toward one clear conclusion. The boy in the courtroom had been present at his mother's death. The boy in the courtroom had deliberately manipulated the security system. The boy in the courtroom had constructed a lie that nearly destroyed his brother's future. With each testimony, the jury's expression grew darker. Jurors who had entered the courtroom with some sympathy for a young defendant, a child who had witnessed violence, a child in pain, gradually came to understand that they were witnessing something different. They were watching the deliberate destruction of a narrative by fact. The younger brother's demeanor began to shift as the evidence accumulated. The composure that had characterized his initial interviews began to crack. He shifted in his seat. He avoided eye contact. He picked at his fingernails. For the first time, he appeared to be experiencing genuine emotion, not grief or remorse, but anger. Anger at being caught. Anger at the evidence that contradicted his narrative. Anger at being forced to sit and listen while experts explained what he had done. The defense presented their case, but it was weak. They couldn't explain the forensic evidence. They couldn't explain the deleted footage. They couldn't explain the search history. They couldn't construct an alternative narrative that made sense. They could only ask the jury for mercy, and mercy requires the defendant to show remorse, to demonstrate understanding of what they've done, to give some indication that they might change. The younger brother did none of these things. The jury deliberated for 3 days. 3 days of reviewing evidence, discussing testimony, trying to reconcile the boy's age with the calculated nature of his crime. 3 days of wrestling with the question of whether a 13-year-old could be held responsible for premeditated murder, whether his youth was a mitigating factor or simply an unfortunate detail that didn't change the reality of what he had done. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the jury returned. They had reached a verdict. The younger brother was found guilty of murder. The verdict was unanimous. Every juror, every single person who had heard the evidence and considered the case, agreed that the younger brother was guilty beyond any reasonable doubt. The older brother was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement. He stood in the courtroom, pale and shaking, looking at the brother who had tried to destroy him. He had not spoken publicly about the experience since his arrest and release. He had carried the trauma silently, trying to process what had happened, trying to understand how his own brother had done this to him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. He described what it felt like to be arrested for a crime he didn't commit. He described the interrogation, the certainty of the investigators that he was guilty, the terror of understanding that the system had turned against him. He described being charged with murder. He described the media attention, the public judgment, the sense that his life was over before he had even truly begun. He described learning that his brother had framed him. He described the shock of understanding that the person he had trusted, the person he had always tried to protect, had deliberately lied to destroy him. He described the loss of his mother, not at his brother's hands in the moment of her death, but through the entire nightmare that had followed, where the grief of losing his mother had been consumed by the trauma of being accused of killing her. He described the conversations he had not been able to have, the funerals he had not been able to grieve at properly, the childhood that had been stolen by his brother's actions. When he finished speaking, there was absolute silence in the courtroom. Even the younger brother seemed affected by the words, though his reaction was hard to interpret. Was it remorse? Was it calculation? Was it anger that his plan had failed? No one could say for certain. The prosecutor called the father to testify. He spoke about the impact on the family. He spoke about his older son's trauma and his younger son's betrayal. He spoke about being forced to choose between his sons, about the impossible situation of having one son victimized by the other. He spoke about the pain of being the parent of a murderer, the shame and the grief and the weight of knowing that he had raised someone capable of doing what his younger son had done. He spoke about his older son's struggle to rebuild his life, about the college plans that had been disrupted, about the future that had been derailed by his brother's actions. He spoke about his deceased wife, about what she had meant to him and to both of their sons, about the loss that none of them would ever fully recover from. The younger brother's attorney made a final argument for mercy. He asked the judge to consider the boy's age, to recognize that adolescent development was still occurring, to consider that there might be hope for rehabilitation. But the judge was not moved. She had listened to the victim impact statements. She had reviewed the evidence. She understood what had been done and who had done it. The sentencing would reflect the seriousness of the crime, even though the defendant was young, and there would be a possibility that the case could be transferred to adult court for sentencing, which meant that the younger brother might face a much harsher penalty than the juvenile system would normally impose. The psychological expert called by the defense tried to argue that the younger brother had experienced some form of dissociation, that he had not fully understood the consequences of his actions, that his behavior was consistent with an adolescent brain still developing its capacity for moral reasoning. The prosecution's expert then took the stand and systematically dismantled these arguments. The younger brother had demonstrated moral understanding throughout his life. He knew it was wrong to lie. He knew it was wrong to accuse his brother falsely. He knew it was wrong to harm his mother. He had chosen to do these things anyway. His actions were not the result of a brain that couldn't understand morality. They were the result of a person who understood morality perfectly well and chose to disregard it because he wanted something more than he cared about right and wrong. The prosecution presented evidence of the younger brother's prior false accusations. Each one was a deliberate lie. Each one had been constructed carefully to manipulate adults. Each one had demonstrated his understanding of how the system worked and how to use it for his own purposes. The pattern of behavior was not consistent with an adolescent struggling with moral development. It was consistent with someone who had learned early that lying was effective, that accusations were powerful, that he could manipulate people by understanding their psychology and using that understanding against them. The defense had no good answer to this. They could only ask for mercy, and judges don't grant mercy to people who show no remorse. The jury deliberation on sentencing took less than a day. The judge had tremendous discretion in how to sentence a 13-year-old convicted of murder, but the evidence of premeditation, manipulation, and lack of remorse pointed toward the harsher end of sentencing possibilities. The younger brother was brought back to court. The sentence was delivered. He would spend the remainder of his childhood and his adolescence in a juvenile detention facility. Upon reaching the age of 18, he would be transferred to adult prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. The judge stated that the nature of the crime, the evidence of premeditation, and the absence of remorse suggested that rehabilitation might not be possible. She stated that the safety of the public had to be the primary consideration. She stated that she was recommending that the case be reviewed for potential transfer to adult court, where he might face a much longer sentence. The media coverage of the verdict was extensive. The story had captured public attention in a way that few cases do. A 13-year-old who murders his mother and frames his brother, the calculated deception, the near success of the false accusation, the forensic evidence that unravels the lie. The narrative was compelling because it was horrifying. It challenged fundamental assumptions about age and innocence. It demonstrated that childhood was not automatically a shield against accountability. It showed that systems of justice, while imperfect, could ultimately find the truth even when it was hidden beneath layers of deception. The younger brother's reaction to the verdict was anger, not remorse. He glared at the jurors as they left the courtroom. He refused to acknowledge his older brother. He showed no indication that he understood what he had done. No indication that he felt any regret. No indication that he believed he had done anything wrong. The judge had to maintain order as the younger brother was removed from the courtroom. The scene was disturbing in its coldness, in the absolute absence of any normal emotional response to being found guilty of murdering one's own mother. The older brother finally allowed himself to begin to cry, not in the courtroom, but in the hallway outside, in the arms of his father. The nightmare that had begun with his arrest, that had continued through his interrogation, that had extended through months of investigation and trial, was finally over. He had been vindicated. The person truly guilty had been convicted. Justice, in its basic form, had been served. But the cost had been enormous. His mother was still dead. His brother was now a convicted murderer. His childhood was destroyed. His trust in people, in systems, in the world itself had been damaged in ways that would take the rest of his life to heal. The sentencing hearing in juvenile court was thorough and considered. The judge reviewed the pre-sentence investigation report. She reviewed the psychological evaluations. She reviewed the impact statements. She listened to the arguments of both the prosecution and the defense. And then she delivered a sentence that reflected the seriousness of the crime while acknowledging the defendant's age. The younger brother would spend his juvenile years in detention with a mandatory review when he reached age 18 to determine whether he should be transferred to adult prison. The judge addressed the younger brother directly. She told him that he had committed a terrible crime. She told him that his premeditation and his lack of remorse were factors that would weigh against him. She told him that his age would be considered, but that age alone did not excuse murder. She told him that he had destroyed his own life just as surely as he had destroyed his mother's. She told him that he would have decades to think about what he had done, to contemplate the consequences, to potentially develop some understanding of the magnitude of his actions. But she noted that his lack of current remorse suggested that understanding might not come, that he might spend the rest of his life unable to comprehend what he had done or why it was wrong. The sentence was delivered. The gavel came down. The younger brother was remanded to juvenile detention. He would grow up in the custody of the state, separated from society, separated from the possibility of normal life. He would be educated behind bars. He would work in prison jobs. He would eventually transition to adult prison. And he would carry with him for the rest of his life the knowledge that he had committed premeditated murder and had nearly succeeded in framing an innocent person for it. Whether he would ever develop remorse, whether he would ever understand what he had done, was uncertain. But he would spend his life facing the consequences of his actions, and for those who believed in justice, this was appropriate. Catherine's mother was interviewed months after the verdict. She had lost a daughter to murder and then lost her grandson to the criminal justice system. She spoke about the pain of attending her daughter's funeral, knowing that her own grandchild was responsible for the death. She spoke about the weight of trying to reconcile the child she had known, or thought she had known, with the criminal he was now proven to be. She spoke about her older grandson and the trauma he had endured. She spoke about the ripple effects of a single act of violence extending through an entire family, destroying relationships, severing bonds, leaving nothing untouched. The older brother struggled with reintegration into normal life. He had lost months to the legal proceedings. He had lost the stability of his home. He had lost his mother. He had lost his younger brother. He had to rebuild his life in the aftermath, had to go to college, had to try to move forward knowing that his brother was in prison, knowing that his brother had done this deliberately. Some days he succeeded. Some days he couldn't get out of bed. The trauma of false accusation, of being treated as a murderer when he was innocent, had left permanent scars. Community reactions were mixed. Some people believed that the younger brother should have been tried as an adult, that the severity of the crime demanded harsher punishment than juvenile court could impose. Some people believed that the younger brother deserved mercy because of his age, that even someone capable of such terrible things could potentially be rehabilitated. Some people simply felt sadness, a recognition that a family had been destroyed, that a mother had been killed, that a brother had been betrayed, and that nothing could fix any of it. The case became one that was discussed in schools, analyzed in psychology classes, used as an example of how deception could nearly thwart the justice system, how young people could commit serious crimes, how the system could be manipulated by someone cunning enough to do it. The interrogation room where it all began is empty now. The recording of the younger brother's first interview has become part of the permanent record. Investigators sometimes review it, studying it with new understanding, recognizing the signs they had missed the first time. The over-rehearsed quality of his responses, the emotional flatness, the calculated performance of grief. The security camera that he had tried to delete recorded the truth despite his efforts. Technology preserved the evidence that human perception had nearly misinterpreted. The backup system that Catherine had installed to protect her home had, ironically, protected the justice system by preserving evidence that would otherwise have been lost forever. Years have passed since the trial. The older brother has graduated from college. He is building a life, trying to move forward, though the shadow of what happened follows him. The younger brother is now an adult in prison. He will spend the majority of his remaining life incarcerated, serving time for premeditated murder. Whether he has developed any capacity for remorse, whether he has come to understand what he did, is known only to him. The case is studied now in law enforcement circles as an example of how investigation can be derailed by a false narrative constructed by a believable witness, and how ultimately physical evidence, digital forensics, and careful analysis can reveal the truth even when it is hidden beneath layers of deliberate deception. Catherine's family has done its best to move forward. The anniversary of her death is marked with flowers and quiet remembrance. Her memory is preserved in the people she touched, the kindnesses she showed, the love she gave to her sons even when one of them was unable or unwilling to reciprocate that love. She deserved better. She deserved to live her life, to watch her sons grow, to eventually see grandchildren, to grow old in peace. Instead, she was murdered by the child she had carried and raised and loved. And that is the tragedy that no verdict, no sentence, no amount of justice can fully remedy. The case serves as a reminder that evil is not always loud or obvious. It is not always visible in the way we expect it to be. Sometimes evil wears the face of a child. Sometimes it speaks with a voice designed to manipulate, with words carefully chosen to influence, with a narrative constructed to redirect blame. Justice does not always arrive quickly. Truth does not always surface immediately. But when systems work as they are designed to work, when investigators refuse to accept the first narrative that is presented to them, when forensic evidence is examined carefully, the truth eventually emerges. And those responsible are held accountable, regardless of their age, regardless of their supposed innocence, regardless of how carefully they have constructed their lies. The smirk that appeared in the interrogation room is gone now. It has been replaced by the reality of years spent in prison, by the weight of what he did, by the consequences that he will face for the remainder of his life. He thought he was clever. He thought he could manipulate the system. He thought he could destroy his brother and escape responsibility himself. He was wrong, and in that wrongness lies the resolution to the story. Justice waited, justice worked, and justice won. The gavel fell, the lie died, and the truth in the end was all that remained.